Welcome to What's Your Signal, the podcast exploring enterprise networking trends and the secure connectivity that underlies it all. You're joined by me, Taylor Walker, and my co-host, Mauricio Steffen. Hey, Mauricio.
Hi Taylor, how's it hanging?
It's going pretty good. Doing pretty good. So Mauricio, in the tech industry, we talk about return on investment or ROI quite a bit. I'm curious, what are some of the areas of your own life where you expect an excellent ROI?
Um, it's really difficult to say where I expect an ROI. I guess it's better to say where I feel like I'm throwing money away and not getting an ROI. Like an example of that is insurance, right? Like you pay for insurance because in case something happens, and when something happens, you get that ROI, right? Is because I don't want to make light of anything, any tragedies or anything, but like, wildfires, those kind of things that, insurance helps with those things, car accidents, insurance helps with those things. And so, in those cases, you definitely get the ROI there. Technology has its own ROIs as well too. Sometimes that's a little more in my personal life, a little more difficult to compound. And then of course, because I'm a gadget guy, there's sometimes where I'm just throwing money away on things that look cool, and you don't get a lot of ROI out of the out of other than maybe the few minutes of joy you get out of it. I mean, I have plenty of little like gadget things like a Flipper Zero or a Raspberry Pi that after that first initial like geek joy that you get from unwrapping it and trying it, it just kind of collects dust because you don't typically have the time to mess with it.
Yeah, I can't relate to the old Flipper Zero, but I do calculate a lot of ROI on like I was thinking about this question and I do calculate a lot of ROI on like personal things. Like one of them is like if I go to the gym like one time, right, then I'm obviously going to be like so much more healthy. And it's a very unrealistic ROI. Like you have to keep going. Or I am constantly calculating the ROI of like paying a babysitter to go to an event. Like, is the event really worth me spending this extra $100 to go? Like, is somebody going to be there that really annoys me? If so, like, it's probably not worth me spending this $100. So I'm always doing like social ROI.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of like I do that a lot. Yeah, you see the TV in the background. Those that can't see the video, my video. But I do that with a lot with streaming services, right? Because it's like, hey, this streaming service costs $10 a month, $12 a month, $5 a month. But maybe there's only one thing. Like I'm a big football fan. I'm a big San Francisco 49ers fan. Didn't make the playoffs. Sucks for us. But a lot of the NFL games are streaming on different networks, Peacock and Paramount Plus, and so there's a lot of ROI involved in like, do I subscribe to this one? I'm also a person who like subscribes and unsubscribes based on like the content that I want to watch, and so it's one of those things. It's like, do I subscribe to this one this month or this one next month or those kind of things? So I do a lot of that too, and then again, the social ROI. Like this past summer, I did a little my own little summer concert tour to see people that I really wanted to see that are, like everyone getting older and may stop touring soon. So I wanted to make sure I got a chance to see them. But then again, that experience, I'm also not a big crowds person, and a ton of people packed in is, not my jam. So there's a lot of ROI there on like, the cost of the ticket plus typically like these are destinations. I mean, I live in the Boise area. We do have our fair share of names come through town, but not like super huge names come through town. Like there's no Taylor Swift coming through Boise, Idaho, so there's typically a little travel involved, but still, it's like that experience is definitely worth what you pay for it sometimes. So I do a little social ROI like you do.
Yeah, I think ROI is really just kind of like the corporate term for pros and cons, right? Just weighing the pros and
Yeah.
cons, like
Is,
finding the
is it
balance
worth
there.
it? Yeah.
Yeah,
ROI is
exactly.
just a fancy term for is it worth it?
Yeah, exactly. And we know that ROI is important in most aspects of life. We've given a lot of examples. But for a company or a government agency, actually measuring ROI is just vital. And then it's so critical to actually analyze that data and adjust it as needed. And today we're talking to some ROI experts about what this process looks like in practice. Nathan McAfee is a principal economic validation analyst for ESG. And also joining us is James Hawk, the VP of Sales Engineering for Ericsson Enterprise Wireless Solutions. Nathan, James, welcome. We are super excited to dig into the nitty gritty of ROI as it relates to tech investments. And first, I want to kick things off by talking a little bit about what not to do. So, Nathan, let's start with you. What do you think are some mistakes that enterprises are prone to when they're figuring out how to measure ROI?
They get too many measurables. It depends on what level you look at in an org. Everybody has their success factors, what determines success. And sometimes when you look what they try to measure, they might be trying to measure 20 or 30 different metrics. And that generally means they aren't looking at it from a high enough perspective, because everybody wants, here's my budget, here's my cost, here's my savings, and they don't look at it from a bigger picture. So I love a show called The Profit, and a guy named Marcus Lemonis, and he made all his money in Camping World. And it's sort of like Shark Tank, but what he does is take a scenario and simplify it. And no matter how complex something is, he breaks it down to people, product, process. And when I see people making mistakes with ROI, they're trying to make it too complex. They're trying to look at it from their specific view instead of the bigger, what's good for the company. So that's the first thing is you're trying to make it too complex. You're not taking a high enough level view.
Yeah.
And then, secondary, no one really wants to look at realized ROI. Nobody wants to let's look at last year's project. You see so much movement in tech companies that somebody else started a project, and if it's successful, they've left. They've taken a step up, taken a step sideways. Somebody else has inherited, and then it's not their baby. So I see too many initiatives that aren't planned beginning to end. They're planned to a hump to allow somebody to move off, and they're just not built to fruition. So it's a bit of a rambling answer, but so many things when you look at, a TCO, what's the actual cost, or ROI when you pull the benefits in, is either too short of a term or too scattered across so many different metrics, you can't really get clarity into the change.
I would actually go, I'll give the other side of that pendulum, and that is when you make it too simple and you miss something that you just assume is a resource that you can consume, and you may be entrenching on someone else's ROI or impacting someone else's within your organization. I tell the story that we were often being in a sales organization, being in a taking care of customers. We do a lot of things before a sale is done, and that is, take care of customers, to work on projects, to do some testing for customers beforehand. And we include some of those things in our ROI calculations. But one of the things in a prior career stop we were missing was, we always assumed test equipment was there. We always assumed the time of the test engineers were there, and we didn't put that into our ROI calculations when we go, how do we take care of a customer in the best way? And so we had a lot of sort of realization or reconciliation along the way to say, we weren't accounting for this particular variable. We weren't accounting for this person's time. And so when we really took a look at holistically the cost of what it meant to work on a project, we missed a few critical things, and that impacted some downstream projects and ability for others to really fund future projects because they didn't see the ROI. Now, ROI for that particular project looked great, but we were sort of consuming others' resources that weren't accounted, and so we were being a little too simple.
Yeah. Well, one thing you just brought up too is it's really hard, if it even is possible, to measure employees' attitude towards change. You can have the best idea, best project, best plan, have access to the resources, but it's hard to calculate that dip in acceptance of, even if it's a great idea, you're going to make me change. So that's something else that really, you really need to temper down your expectations to recognize that people just don't like the change.
And
That is
that
true.
can change with change, right? Like as they get change fatigue, so that can consistently change. So that's a hard one to pinpoint, I'm sure.
Yeah,
Yes.
I think the three of us from Ericsson can understand change fatigue in the recent years.
Do you guys have some big fails that you've seen when it comes to ROI measurement? You don't have to name any names, but are there any kind of epic learning moments that you've been a part of or observed?
That's a good one. I would say one of the biggest things would be measuring the wrong things, where you put too much stock, and this is something that you, with the best intentions, and I think this goes back to something that Nathan just mentioned, and that is accounting for change. That you can start out on a project looking and tracking for one specific metric within an ROI calculation. And along the way, the market changes a little bit, right? Maybe the consumer, right, in this case, in a B2B environment, their buying patterns or their buying habits change a little bit, right? And we see that with sort of the evolution of certain product families, certain technologies, that if I'm going after a certain ROI, it can look great. But what's happening underneath is the consumer, the B2B consumer is starting to change their buying habits. And so not accounting for change and understanding that those metrics looking great can sort of conceal something happening but behind the scenes. So that's probably the biggest fail that I've seen, kind of translating that into what we do every day at Ericsson, is you've got to be able to account for change and look behind the numbers consistently.
Yeah. My answer is somewhat the same, but it's really the cost of inactivity. Is you go in and you talk to somebody and you hear them say, "Well, we thought about this a year ago, but we waited." It's somewhat easy to project your missed opportunity, but it's hard to stack rank where you are as far as a competitive advantage. The different things coming out right now as people are looking at the impact of AI, and do I need to jump in, trying to figure out, is it worth it to wait until something's more mature? Is it worth it to get an early advantage? So a lot of the big surprises were, we thought about this last year. Now let's look at the difference in the market, as James just said, from when we thought to when we're ready to make a change, and what missed opportunities we had. It's not always a negative. Sometimes letting other people, be the first to jump in that water is a good thing for the learnings, but just to realize the value of that time of inactivity is a pretty big
Mm-hmm.
finding.
Yep.
Hey, Nathan, you brought up a term a couple minutes ago that I just want to touch on real quick, right? You brought up TCO, which is total cost of ownership. Maybe you could go a little bit more on how TCO and ROI are related, and how they are different terms.
A lot of people just bleed them together. In my mind, TCO is the check that you write, the money that comes out of your budget. What is your cost of doing something? ROI is the upside, when you look at the benefits, the business enablement, the things that change the way you do business. So we go in, and when I was talking about people that want to take a narrower view, they generally are looking at TCO. My budget is 3 million. I need to get it down to 2.8. When you look at ROI, my output is 5 million. We want to figure out a way to increase our revenue to, hopefully hit both ends of the calculation, reduce cost and increase output. So difference between TCO is how much do I pay, ROI, how much does my business generate, or we realize.
Thanks for sharing that. That's helpful. And it might kind of blend into this next question that I have for James, which is, over the years, you've developed your own ROI calculator. And I'd like to learn a little bit more about how that's structured and some of the lessons you learned during that process.
Yeah, and thank you, Taylor. And it's had different iterations throughout the years, but I would say we're probably on version 27, 28 at this point. But with that comes the opportunity to really develop it for sort of the currencies that are within my organization, and that is it's not always just dollars. I mean that's a big part of it. But when you look at what I run and have the opportunity to lead a field engineering organization for Ericsson. And one of the things that we have to be very, very mindful of is, the amount of projects or what we call proof of concepts that we get to do with customers, and how many of those can be handled by any particular engineer at one time, right? Because you want to make sure that each and every one of those engagements are spent with quality time with our customers. You don't want to say, well, hurry through this one so you can get to the next one. You really want to give that opportunity for that engineer to spend that critical development time with a customer before they purchase. Because that's where you define a lot of your success criteria. You understand where the pitfalls of certain configuration elements could be. And so what we've done with the calculator version that we have right now is we take a look at, how many projects can a particular engineer handle at any one time, right? And then we look at over a quarter's time, how many can they realistically address and get to while servicing all of the other ones by giving a quality experience to our customers. And then you extrapolate that across dozens of projects, dozens of engineers, and you really start to understand the return on investment of a particular engineer's time. And so that's our currency, right? And this model, particularly in the version that exists today, the currency is that engineer's time. And then you look at it, and conversely, one of the other things that we track is really the success of a project, right? How happy are our customers with that particular project? And oftentimes we are operating anywhere from a quarter, 2 quarters, 3 quarters before a customer decides whether or not to purchase. And so it's not always tied to sales dollars. It's tied to sort of the success of a particular engagement. Did we help the customer sort of rationalize through all of their decision criteria on the technical side? And so that's really the return on investment, right? So how long did that particular project take versus did we get to the point where we could look back and converse with that customer and say, this is what we define success as at the beginning of the project. This is what we've been able to show you at the end of the project. And were we able to do that in the time that we committed to them? So a great ROI is being able to spend time with the customers, get a quality outcome, and not really impact that particular engineer's ability to handle the other projects that we've assigned to them. So you mix all of those things together. So we track some of the things that are in the calculator that we track are, the number of engagements that they're working on, the intensity or the complexity of those engagements. And then we look at the activities that go in, how many hours they're spending on each particular activity. That could be configuration. It could be working with our great friends in our product groups like Mauricio, and working through what we need to do in maybe a future iteration of the code or the hardware. And that's really what goes into that calculator. And it's something that we look at on a daily basis. And it's something that is critical for us to understand, to make sure that when we give commitments back to customers, that they are clear, they're concise, and they are accurate.
I've got to know, James, with all the iterations that you've done of the calculator, have you figured out the ROI of ROI? Like, do we actually save much time by saying ROI instead of return on investment, and how much time?
It provides you 1.2 parsecs of additional time. So
I knew that you would know. I knew that you would know. Okay. So Nathan, I want to ask you, what do you feel are some of the most important ROI related questions to ask before starting a major tech rollout?
To always start with the pain, to look at the challenges, to find out what are your measurables and what impacts that. What are you trying to focus on? Some people focus on growth, some people focus on whatever those are, to really look and see what's causing you problems right now. Whether it's productivity, whether it's the turnover and the cost of getting new employees up to a certain point. So I always start with the challenges. Then look at the different people that you need to influence. So James hit this on the head, early on, coming up with a plan. Here, make this change. It's great. Here's going to be your impact, but you need to look across all the different stakeholders. You need to understand from the finance side, how are you going to pay for it? Even if I can save so much money, how am I going to actually take that bump? Look at the support side, look at the sales side, look at all the different people that you need to influence, and try to figure out what is tangible to them. You have to look at what's tangible, what's intangible. You have to look at what's, mundane and what's strategic, and try to tick all four of those boxes for each of those stakeholders. So you start with the pain, and then you start looking for the pull. What benefits are going to impact each of those stakeholders, and get them over the hurdle of, yes, I will support this change. So I think I ended up answering a question you didn't ask, but you start with the pain, then you look at it across everybody you need to try to, I'll say influence, everyone you need to try to educate, and try to figure out how do you tick those four boxes? How do you get the easy stuff? And how do you step them up to the point to look at the intangible yet strategic that applies to their position?
Well, and your answer, I think, kind of brings up a point that there's so many variances in the types of ROI data that companies monitor and that they're looking for. And so some of it's really black and white, like dollars and cost savings. And there's also a lot of anecdotal ROI information. And so and this is a question for both of you, how can companies balance those two things when they're reporting and evaluating ROI? Like, how do they make sure that they're not leaning too far one way and too far the other?
Yeah, before you guys answer, I want to throw something else into Taylor's question too, right? Along with those kind of more fungible things, like how do you factor in risk mitigation into the ROI calculation, right? Is because we kicked off the show by talking about ROI in our personal lives, and insurance is one of those things that doesn't typically have an ROI until something goes wrong. And so thinking through things like security, right? Security is important, but it doesn't necessarily have a dollar figure unless you have a breach. And in that case, there is a dollar figure tied to the breach and the bad PR. So along the lines of what Taylor asked, like how do you factor some of those risk mitigation things into the ROI calculation?
Well, I could answer, spending time with customers my entire career, there's power in community. And you talk about risk mitigation, Mauricio, and that's really where that being able to build relationships across your community to understand that it may not have real world, equations that are real world for you, but I guarantee someone in your corporate community reaching across the aisles to complementary in industry partners, they're going to have some real world data around if this happens, then that happens. And relying on that community, you can get some of those real world scenarios to drive some of your data models in ROI. So I would say that's something that we, especially on the vendor side, being able to spend time with our customers and understand some of the trials and tribulations they've gone through, because you can help other customers out without disclosing important and confidential information. You can give them pointers around, this happens, generically you mentioned insurance industry. If a remote office goes down for any period of time where they can't write a policy, they can't process a claim, there's probably a certain dollar amount that for every hour that they can't do something, that they can equate that to, revenue lost or impact to the business. And that's normally there's some sort of equitable or equation that can drive most industries. So helping define that within your community is probably one of the best things a company can do where they may not have experienced it just yet.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it's gotten to the point. I mean, there's so many different numbers around that the one I usually go is about you're running about 11% risk per year of a successful attack. And pretty much every major study has something in that range. And if you're in, I mean, if you're in this business, you know somebody, one of your peers is going through the misery right now of trying to, trying to figure out a path, through whether it be a human error cause, whether it be ransomware, some type of situation. And I always start the conversation by saying, what's the value of a door lock? Not a cent until somebody rattles your door. So we've reached the point, if you had asked me this question 2 years ago, this was somebody else's problem. Somebody else was getting hit by ransomware. And it's reached the point, you realistically in the US are running about 11% chance per year that it's going to be your problem. So it's no longer somebody else's grief.
Nathan, you recently worked with us at Ericsson Enterprise Wireless Solutions on an ROI report about the value of cellular solutions for fixed locations. I'd love to hear a little bit about how that process was set up and anything that kind of surprised you about those findings or the process itself.
Yeah, I went through, and again, I started with the pain. I looked at challenges companies have with, trying to set up WANs, and I ended up interviewing quite a few customers and talked to them. And what surprised me, I went in thinking this is a great enablement solution. This allows somebody that can't get, access to quick and easy access. But what I heard from so many people was this changed the way we approached our business. We now have expansion plans that we couldn't touch in the past. And it wasn't, as an ROI analysis or analyst, I have a decent idea of the technology, but really I'm looking at business change. All I do is look at change in business and figure out a way to put a number on it. But as I was learning the technology, it went from, hey, this is a great secondary solution, to this changes the way I can expand because I no longer have that constraint of connectivity. So that's probably the biggest thing that surprised me as I went in and really learned about it.
Yeah, that's interesting. James, and this kind of ties back to a little bit of what we've talked about before, but what do you think companies can do to really make sure they're getting the most value out of their ROI data to make good decisions when it comes to tech investments?
Oh, that's a good one. And something that I've sort of realized throughout my career is not to be afraid of the data, right? Because when you go into a situation, there's always the opportunity to tweak your algorithms, to tweak your analysis to get the result that you want. And that may help you in the short term, but it doesn't necessarily help you make great business decisions for the long term. And so really, Taylor, I think the adage of data is data. Don't be afraid of the negative because it's going to give you insight into the business. It's going to give you the power to make the right decisions, even if on the surface it maybe wasn't the result you were hoping for that particular project.
Nathan, is there anything that you'd add to that?
So much of what I like to do is realized ROI. To do a post-analysis of a change and figure out the next change, what are we going to do differently? How are we going to do it better? And I really would, I would love to dig in and really do some research there to figure that out. It's just a passion of mine I'm strange. I love looking at change. I love trying to figure out who does it impact? Why do they do it? How did it end up? And you never see post-analysis.
Yeah, people probably finish up and then, like you guys were saying earlier, this industry moves so fast that they're like, well, we just got to keep going, keep moving forward. It's easier to do sometimes than looking backward. So, well, guys, I think we've gotten some decent ROI out of this ROI conversation. So congrats to us for that. James, you can put that in your Put that in your calculator and calculate it.
And the calculator said we did great. So
Perfect. Well, I want to thank you both for joining us to chat about this. It's kind of I think it's a topic we don't really bring up too often that like to actually sit down and have a conversation about. And so it's interesting to hear both of your perspectives on it and through the lens of the experience that you have. So thank you so much for joining us to chat about it.
Happy to share. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, guys.
So, Mauricio, it's interesting to talk about ROI. I think what I was expecting going into this conversation was a lot of data, like a lot of numbers. I was expecting our guests to say things like, well, when companies hit like 80% of XYZ, then that's more. I was surprised to not really hear that. And I was pleased to not hear that because I think that can kind of intimidate people when they think about trying to calculate ROI. And so they might try to overcomplicate it or not really know like what numbers to chase. And so this helps to understand what the balance is.
Yeah, absolutely. I also think it's one of those things where people just generally, because it is a lot of numbers and it is trying to quantify things that might not be quantifiable, or trying to quantify things that might happen that are not good, and you don't want to think about those things. And so I think, a lot of times, myself included, you get wrapped up in the coolness of the technology and what it can do for you and all the brand new things. And, depending on how nerdy you want to get, what are the cool things that were implemented in. And one of the things that you forget to think about is how much value am I going to derive from this thing, right? It's one of those things, and not just how much value am I going to derive for it, but can it increase efficiencies? Can it increase my sales? Can it increase, those things where it's like, I think a lot of times too that we talk about like applications or solutions paying you back, but something Nathan said earlier was, even though it may pay you back through increased efficiencies or increased sales or reduced complexity, there's still that initial capital outlay for whatever it is. And so even though, eventually you might get to the point where it's paying it back, you still have to figure out, how to pay for it up front, how to justify that, how to track it over the long term to ensure that you're getting that ROI, right? Both James and Nathan said that a lot of times, especially in the tech sector where there's a lot of movement between companies of people, people plan for getting to that hump and then they don't plan to continue tracking it through the life cycle of that to understand that fully realized ROI, like Nathan said. So while probably not the most sexy technical topic on the planet, it is very much an important one when deciding the value of solutions for your business or like we talked about at the top of the episode, in your personal life.
And Mauricio, for what it's worth, I feel like hosting this podcast with you has had a great ROI.
It has definitely been a great ROI. It has been a fun year, and hopefully we have many more.
We will. Well, thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this conversation about best practices for ROI planning and monitoring, please share it with a friend and then rate and subscribe to What's Your Signal wherever you listen to podcasts.